We're continuing with the push to 350 subscribers, people, with the next HBO Max drop and the latest musical. Wonderful, because we have another one of those to cover. In the Heights, written by Lin-Manuel Miranda and directed by Jon M. Chris, are you as excited, hopefully in a way that I wasn't, to watch this?
Man, I think there's good and bad to take away from this movie. I wouldn't sell it so short right away.
I'll only say that because I'll just get this over with in the preamble. I hate musicals as movies. I really, really do, especially modern ones. But we'll get into that and more on today's podcast. Buddy, so we're back. We've got another musical to talk about. You know, like, it's funny because as we're getting more so into like the summer trend, right? We're getting back into like kind of the genre pieces, right? That kind of got lost with the overall shuffle. We got horror last week. We had musicals this week, ultimately. So, like, I don't know. Before we kind of got into this, I just wanted to break down, like, what your, like, history and relationship with musicals was. Because, like, I've had an interesting relationship with them. And, I know that you, like, have certain thoughts about just, like, theater in general. But, like, I wanted to gauge your thought process as far as that goes before we really jumped into this movie. Because I feel like it's going to have a lot to do with our conversation today.
Sure, yeah. So I kind of have this personal inner monologue with myself where basically I don't believe in regrets. I think you shouldn't really dwell that much in the past. But I always say if I had any regrets from high school, it was not doing either marching band or theater. You know, I played sports and I enjoyed the athletic side of things, but I also was always more foot in the artistic pool. So I do regret not taking the plunge into this medium. So I've always had like an affinity for this style of storytelling, even though I haven't consumed as much of it as I probably would have liked. But I still did grow up in a household where my grandparents lived with us, and they're honestly both pretty, I'd say, eclectic in what they like to consume and watch. And so they'd go from like, you know, Seinfeld reruns to like, hey, 42nd Street's on. You should sit down and watch this because actually it was a movie first and then a musical got made off of it. And, oh, you haven't, your parents didn't show you Oklahoma? Well, let's watch this. And so I do have a decent background of, you know, Fred Astaire and sort of like old showbiz style type stuff from just being in the 3-generational household my whole life. And so I always have like a soft spot for this medium because I think I've seen the best of it and I've enjoyed the best of it. That's not to say I'm an expert by any means, but I definitely am not one of those guys who's like, oh, we're covering a musical this week. Come on, man. Can we find something else in the schedule? Like, I'm always for entertaining the idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah, my whole thing with it is that I've never been somebody who I would consider to be like a musical theater fan as far as that goes, right? But weirdly enough, the more that I think about it, I feel like it was always the genre and medium that had like one of those like kind of slowly creeping, encroaching things, encroaching things that like without even me realizing, kind of, you know, because like we watch like every single Disney movie that I watched when I was a kid was a musical, right? So obviously like I always loved that idea of like, you know, singing songs on my off time, right? Because I grew up with the Disney songs, right? And as I got older and I started to get into some more of the musicals that like my parents grew up with, right? Like I always remember it was a couple of big ones. It was Sound of Music, it was Mary Poppins, which again kind of falls under the Disney train. And then when I got into middle school, it was The Music Man, right? And those are the big things, right? But musicals were never really those movies that as I got older, I kind of went out of my way to watch, right? Like I never watched Rent. I never got into Bye Bye Birdie. Like my whole thing is that as I was growing up, right? Like when I was a little kid, my parents both worked in the city and they would usually take us. It was kind of interesting as far as that goes because we're getting a little bit more into my backstory, but I feel like it's all the pieces are crucial as far as determining kind of my current relationship with movies, right? And then we take us to see all these musicals when we were kids, right? I remember very vividly I saw Lion King on Broadway for my 10th birthday. I saw Tarzan. I actually saw one of the original runs of Wicked when I was like really, really young, like with Kristen Chenoweth and Idina Menzel, and I still have like very, very vivid memories of that. And I always loved it, right? But something odd happened, right? So obviously, as I got older, you know, I grew a little bit out of that phase, right? I started to get more into, you know, what I liked, you know, starting to get into altruistic work and mostly crime-related stuff as far, you know, movie-related. You know, like when I watched The Godfather when I was a freshman in high school, I feel like I had to like set
good correction there.
A difference there. Otherwise, who knows? You know, my new bald head may have signified a slight change in lifestyle that people may not be ready for.
We're going to see Dom's mugshot as like the thumbnail for the next podcast. Oh, my God.
Sorry for that tangent, but to get a little bit back on track, obviously, I think it's safe to say that I kind of left that stage of my life behind as I got older, right? But something interesting happened where in the last couple of years, right, I've been finding that more and more elements from my childhood, not necessarily elements that were kind of like, oh, it was obvious that these were going to make a comeback, but it's always right the elements that you least expect that are going to make the comeback, right? The things where it's like, oh man, I thought this was this one thing that only I loved and now everyone else loves, right? And in a way, what I learned is that with the internet, after a while, all of those things start to creep back into your life without you realizing it, right? At different points. And so musicals was one of those things that I'd pretty much left behind, but in a way that I hadn't really thought about, right? Because it never, like, as far as like the actual musicals themselves, they never really had an impact on me as a kid in a way that like really made me remember like enjoying them, right? If that makes any sense. So in 2016, there was a little movie that came out called La La Land. And I remember seeing the trailers for it and being really, really like visually entranced. I thought the visuals were incredible. You know, I was at the peak of like my film bro phase, right? I think I'd seen Moonlight like a couple weeks before. And I'm like, I am ultimately like better than everyone else because I've seen this one movie that not a lot of people, that barely anyone will, but it's probably one of the best movies of the year. And I thought that La La Land was going to have that same effect. And needless to say, I was very surprised when La La Land turned out to be a musical. I had it was pretty all over the marketing. I still have no idea how I missed this, but La La Land, it turned out, was a musical. And I had not seen a musical movie, live action, in some time. So it definitely threw me off as far as that goes. And that kind of jarring feeling of like not really knowing how like the elements that make them so wonderful to watch on stage versus the things that make movies like really enjoyable to me personally. I don't know. There was just some sort of weird disconnect that happened there, right? Where I recognized the brilliant filmmaking, but there was something about the qualities of it that made it a musical that just held me back from like really fully enjoying it. And to an extent, I still just don't particularly enjoy it. And that experience continued as musicals started to make a comeback. Now, I want to make a very, very clear distinction here because as the internet tends to do in oversimplifying everything, right? I have this set as I have these very strong particular feelings that I'm going to get into for the rest of this podcast towards musicals, which is movies that have long extended sequences in which characters break the realm of reality in which they are living in order to perform these elaborate song and dance numbers, right? I do not qualify movies that are about bands, aka That Thing You Do, or Sing Street, or like any other movie about a band, basically.
About Rocket Man.
That I'll get into that actually. Rocket Man that's a musical. That's a musical, but that's weird because that straddles a line. So band movies or musical biopics, i.e. Straight Outta Compton or Bohemian Rhapsody or Walk Hard. Those are not musicals. Those are musical biopics. But we'll get into Rocket Man as far as that goes and how that's able to get away with that. But I do not qualify those two groups of movies within musicals. Like what I'm talking about for the purposes of what doesn't work for me, these are solely musicals. You know, your Beauty and the Beast, your Rents, all of those, right? So that's kind of I just feel like I needed to like break that ice as far as that goes.
Little Mermaid, musical.
Exactly. Like all the Disney animated movies qualify for me. A majority of those qualify as musicals.
I think we have an established mutual baseline here to build off of.
Definitely. So I just wanted to say that going in because I feel like all of those are going to factor into my arguments before we even start to talk, I feel like, about this movie in general. But like, Chris, my only question is, were you aware of like the history of In the Heights as far as like its history on Broadway and it's going towards the screen?
No, I was actually going to say to you, if this was an original screenplay by Lin-Manuel Miranda, I would really love to go see the play because one thing I forgot to add was until the pandemic, every summer I'd go to about 2 or 3 Shakespeare on the Park productions. We're actually lucky enough in our area to have one of the premier Shakespeare troupes in the world, thankfully, like in our backyard. So I do enjoy going to theater. I've seen so many different plays and stuff, and I kind of like felt something was, without spoiling our thoughts on In the Heights, a little bit lost on the screen, that there would be a richness in the theater, in the human to human, audience looking at someone on a stage interaction. Without that, I felt it fell a little short. So I'm glad to hear that it actually is a play because I actually very much so would be curious to go and see it. Did it have a Broadway run? I would assume.
Yeah, it had a very extensive Broadway run. It actually premiered all the way back in 2005. Interestingly enough, so it's been around a while. Like that's the thing. Like people,
because there's another musical that's sort of popping up in the zeitgeist with the trailer that recently made a little bit of noise called Dear Evan Hansen.
Yes, it has.
So I just was wondering because I know of that Broadway run, just because in the music scene in my circles, it's one of the few plays that like a lot of my modern music friends, we all kind of enjoy that style of like light rock musical type thing. So I was familiar with that, but I wasn't sure about this one. So that's good to know.
Yeah, definitely. This one has been around since 2005, and actually plans to turn this into a movie have been around since 2008. Universal was originally going to do it when they adapted it. It was going to be for release in 2011. Kenny Ortega was apparently going to direct it, apparently. But again, a big thing as to why a traditionalist studio, right? And this is also going to factor in as well. I feel like to our arguments as to why potentially this movie may not have done as well as it could have, which is that the reason why Universal ended up bailing on it and why a lot of studios bailed on it for a while is because they couldn't get any big name stars for it. You know, at one point they were considering, they wanted actors like Shakira or Jennifer Lopez, basically a bankable star to be in this, and they just never could get it, right? So discussions kind of died there, but then they came back in 2012 roughly when Miranda, you know, obviously was working on Hamilton, so he was obviously starting to get a little bit of cred behind his name. Then, unfortunately, so in 2016, it was announced that he was going to co-produce it with one Harvey Weinstein. And then, needless to say, everything that happened there happened, and they ended up auctioning it off, and then Warner Brothers ended up buying it for $50 million, basically. And basically, they were apparently so into it that they apparently built like an entire backlot bodega with actual Piragua cards in order to persuade both Miranda and Jon M. And then they officially got underway in October 2018 as far as getting everything going as far as that goes. So it's had a little bit of an interesting backstory as far as how it's gotten to the screen, right? And so now that we've actually seen the movie, right, in order to kind of transition this into some of our spoiler-free thoughts before we start to break down some of the rest of the movie, what's it called? Oh my God, brain fart just happened there. So this movie obviously was announced as part of the big HBO Max lineup that happened back in November, right? And the big thing that I noticed was I'm like, okay, this is one of those plays that a lot of people are going to be excited about because this is one of those plays that a lot of my theater friends, you know, because I was friends with, I'll say like I had my sect of theater kid friends that I was friends with throughout school. This was one of like 3 or 4 plays that like they would not shut up about. It was like this, Rent, Hamilton, and Dear Evan Hansen was making the rounds, but I don't know if it was as popular. I don't know if it was like to the like maximum level of like peak enjoyment amongst theater heads that it was like when that it was like in the last couple of years really in it being adapted. But In the Heights was one that I've been hearing about for quite some time, like since my time at Dutchess Community College. And again, like my whole thing is I'm like, okay, I don't go out of my, like the most that I remember about going to Broadway plays is going to see whatever I would want, you know, whatever I would with my parents. I'd seen a couple of plays recently at that point. I'd seen South Pacific with my grandparents. I saw Jersey Boys, which I enjoyed very much, and I'd seen Fiddler on the Roof at that time period. So I was sort of starting to get back into musicals as far as that goes on plays. And I was kind of like starting to like rekindle myself to everything that I loved about seeing them on stage. And after watching this movie, I can safely say that I feel like, without actually discussing anything in the movie yet, this kind of is reaffirming to me of everything. And I'll say this right now as to why I don't necessarily think that musicals, right, straight up musicals, differentiated from band movies and musical biopics, straight up musicals do not work as movies. And the reason why I say that is because I think there's an inherent distinction between kind of what your brain has to do in order to like acknowledge, right, and buy into the story of seeing something on stage versus seeing something like with a screen in front of it, right? And I can't really, and the thing is, I can't really explain it just yet because the weird thing is that, and I have to go back and rewatch some of the older ones, is that with the older ones, like the ones made before 1970, right, your Sound of Musics, right, your Music Mans, right, your, what's it called, your Mary Poppins, right? None of those I would say have a problem with, right, if that makes any sense. But specifically with this movie, right, as far as this is another one, very much so like, I would say Les Mis, where it's like, they're not like long sequences, right, where they're like where there's like actual dialogue before they transition into song and dance numbers. Like 95% of this movie is song and dance numbers. These very elaborately drawn out, very heavily choreographed. Like honestly, like exceedingly well made. Like that's the one thing I will say. The filmmaking in this movie is impressive, to say the least. Right? There's a reason why they got Jon M specifically for his work with Crazy Rich Asians. Like he's got a very vibrant color palette. He's got a very over stylized sense, right? But not in like a Baz Luhrmann way where there's so much editing going on that you can't really keep track, so your brain is like getting a headache from like the amount of stuff that they're trying to fit in. Like he's very good about letting the camera linger, letting the camera hover on the individual characters as they're going, you know, into their song, into their bits and their song and dance numbers. I'm sorry, I'm not as technically proficient. I don't know all of the exact wording and terminology with it. But all of that stuff, as far as the technicals, I think is really, really good. I also like the cast. I like that this movie in particular kind of went against what it is that kind of killed the original version of this film when it was going to be adapted back in the late 2000s, which is that they don't actually have really any big name stars in this movie, right? We're going to get into that in a little bit as far as how that may have actually been a detriment in a weird way, but like you've got Anthony Ramos as the star who starred, obviously famously came up with Lin in the original run of Hamilton. You got Corey Hawkins, famously for, ironically enough, you know, playing Dr. Dre in Straight Outta Compton. You have Jimmy Smits. But for the most part, those are really like the only. And I recognized Rosa from from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Stephanie Beatrice is one of the salon ladies. But other than that, like there aren't any big name stars in this, right? It's mostly like character actors and like Broadway people and international cast. Like it's incredibly diverse, right? I don't think there's a single white cast member in this entire movie. Right, I think it's primarily Latino and African American stars. So, kind of before we dive into like kind of, you know, what worked about this movie and what didn't, you know, what were your thoughts kind of both going into this movie with what I told you about it beforehand versus coming out of this movie?
Yeah, well, let me just say I totally disagree with your sentiment of the fact that musicals don't work as movies. I think filmmaking's gotten lazy. In 1990 onward. I think 1994 to me, based off the studies and what we've kind of been doing here on the podcast in the past few years, seems where we peaked, really, as far as a beautiful blend between storytelling and audience engagement and just the overall product being a little bit of something for everyone. Because I mean, if you go back and you look at Oklahoma, you look at 42nd Street, which was famously the movie before it became one of the longest running plays ever in Broadway. I mean, that movie had to be good to go on to garner that type of response, right? I just think it's what we've been learning doing this whole action movie sort of thing this year, right? Like we always joke behind the scenes that this is the year of action movies on Talkin TV because we've been sort of going back and playing catch up for me on some of the sort of one-off action films like the Face-Offs of the world that I hadn't seen. And then, of course, catching me up on some franchises that started in the 90s, like Mission Impossible, which I recently covered this past year for the show. And, of course, Fast and Furious, which started in 2001, which had some of that lingering 1990 isms to it. Of course, like the first few years of any decade aren't really established yet or defined as their own unique thing. And you can see through the progressions of all these franchises just how quickly we become, as I like to use a lot on the show lately, homogenized, or the Marvel isms seep through. And I don't blame Marvel. They did something no one's been able to do. I think we were heading this way before Marvel came around, but filmmaking has just become more sloppy and lazy. And obviously it's because of the internet and streaming being the first real competitor to the traditional theater system. There's so many variables, right? But I just think it's unfair to say that they don't work as movies because we've had so many points and examples of them working in the past, especially when you think about where everything we love came from, right? Film and TV came from vaudeville and these like variety shows where the host had to be able to sing, act, dance, like all of these. He even had to do a little comedy, or she even had to do a little comedy, so it's like I think the multifaceted sort of mixing of genres and styles is really what Hollywood's built upon. And I would rather say we lost it rather than the movies have lost the ability to be good in them. I just think it comes down to knowing your history and all the musicians that I love, that I see them as true artists that aren't just trends in the moment. They can go back and they can name like the BB King records. Like they're not just playing a style that was built upon something of which they know nothing about. They know the homework. They understand the history, and it enriches their art. And so like I think Lin-Manuel Miranda does actually know musical history. I mean, he knows obviously history with Hamilton, no pun intended there, no joke intended. But so I think like he is a true artist for sure. Um, but I just don't think we have a lot of those, and I think that's why a lot of these musicals fall on their faces, especially in modern days. And it's even crazy when you have ones that are built on like legends like Elton John, and that movie is just god awful and atrocious and
Yeah.
terrible. And he's even a
Yeah.
consultant on it, and it fails as miserably as it does. It just shows like, man, like I don't know. We went to film school. I had no classes that, aside from watching Citizen Kane and Battleship Potemkin, thank you, Professor Pat, that gave me any sort of enrichment in old classic filmmaking. And that's a huge part of it. Understanding, I think, the shoulders of which you stand upon, because I always thought of art as carrying the torch forward, right? You're building upon what someone put before you. So I do disagree with that sentiment, although I can see how it's marred and it's lost. And I just don't think, because like a lot of our friends, man, they can't name movies like
It's true.
10 years before they're born. Like
Yep.
they can't name songs like 10 years before they're born. Like an old song to them is 5 years old.
Yep.
An old song is Beethoven or something. An old song is like Gregorian chant, like,
Yep.
like from
Yep.
the 1200s. Like,
I'm with you. I'm with you as
But-
far as it goes. So I was actually going to say, like, talk more about that, because we talked a lot about, kind of there are just kind of the disconnect of this specific generation of artists versus what came before that, right? But like, why do you think that? Is it only because of the internet, or is there more to that? Because I feel like we've kind of hinted at that in previous podcasts, but like, I wanted to dive more into that because you're 100% right with all the points that you brought up.
well, again, it's only my opinion. Obviously, we're like-minded and we're friends, and in our personal conversations kind of echo some of what we're saying here right now. But I just think I think it's a lot of different factors. I think definitely the internet and sort of that whole statistic of like the human attention span shrinking to like less than 7 seconds just because of how fast information travels, and you have 7 seconds to hook someone. I don't necessarily know how true that is or not, but the fact that that's like a verifiable statistic is insane, because I remember looking, and I don't remember the exact number, but in the past it was a far higher number. It was still within the seconds that you had to hook someone and rope them in. Like, this is an advertising statistic, so think commercials aren't that long, but like just the fact that the window is that short, you only have 7 seconds to make an impact because of how fast technology and information moves. That's pretty crazy to me. I also think musicals are a bit of an antiquated style. And I only really think they are because of the way that they've been treated and handled and sort of put on the shelf, in a sense, as like this old sort of nostalgic item that you only dust off when you want a taste of yesteryear. Again, I think that that's a little distasteful, and I think Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing a great job of trying to change that. But he's like really the only playwright turned screenwriter that I could name that's really making an impact in the modern day. Maybe, just maybe, who does the Phantom of the Opera? The
Andrew
legend,
Lloyd Webber.
Andrew Lloyd Webber. Maybe he's like the only other one, right? But even he's getting up there in years, and he hasn't. He tried, and he definitely made an impact. The movie it made money regardless if it was good or bad, and obviously, like, Phantom of the Opera was huge, and it's of recent time, and then Cats as well. But it's just like there's like the only two right there. Like, who else can you name?
Right.
We can name like
Yeah.
I can name 30 horror directors if you give me time. I can name 2 playwrights in the modern day that are pushing the flag, and maybe that just shows how far outside of our realm we are right now. And if we are, let us know, obviously, in the comments what you think. But just as a musician and as someone who maybe not has been a film connoisseur for as long as you, but certainly has studied art in the industry because I want to be in it. These are just some of the things I personally feel.
See, this is why I knew that you were going to be able to give me the perspective that I needed, because like I'll admit, like as into film as I am, I'll admit there are certain areas that I'm very weak with, and musical is one of them. But I think you hit the nail on the head as far as the point that you made about musicals and specifically that style of storytelling being an antiquated style. I think that you hit it 100%, because again, like with the exception of like those few people, right? Joel Schumacher with what he did with that Phantom of the Opera movie that came out in 2004, Tom Hooper, right, with his most recent adaptations with Les Mis and Cats, both of which have been, the reactions to those movies have been very, very mixed. And now with everything that Lin-Manuel Miranda is trying to do, and props to him for trying to do it, because you're right, I think he is the only one that is trying to take that antiquated style of storytelling and not improve it, but like come up with a new style like for a modern day audience. You know, I think he's been largely successful with Hamilton, right? But like, what other ones has there been besides Hamilton? I feel like this is the first one that like would have had a chance to make an impact. You know, it's not just this. I know he's also got a movie coming out on Netflix later this year with Andrew Garfield called Tick Tick Boom, which is actually that's going to be another interesting new take on it, where Andrew Garfield is portraying the writer of Rent, and it's kind of like all the events that he goes through as far as like how he wrote it. And I think you hit the nail on the head, because the style of musical storytelling is very antiquated, and because it hasn't been, I feel like, as rich of like a money grab, say, in more recent times as it was back in the day in like the 50s and 60s, when like musicals would be like some of the highest grossing movies of the year would be musicals as far as that goes, because that's like all that people ended up wanting to go and see because they couldn't afford to go to Broadway, right? I think that there hasn't been enough of an attempt and an effort by Hollywood in order to continue to, for lack of a better word, modernize it, right? And yes, Lin gets the props that he does for that, right? And I think that this movie is definitely stepping in the right direction as far as modernizing it, but I still think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done as far as that goes, right? Because I'll admit, there's still a lot for me that is missing from some more of the recent musical adaptations, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say this was perfect by any means of any stretch of the imagination, but I do think what he does with sort of, and I don't think it's contrived or forced either. I mean, I think he probably genuinely was a fan of hip hop and also was a fan of musicals, and he kind of found like a beautiful medium, a perfect way to fuse the two, which no one really has done before. And obviously he also knows his culture very well, so he's able to sort of bring some of the styles of music that I'm not really that familiar with, like all of like the many different variations of Latin music, and fuse like these three genres together, right? And it's kind of like a beautiful blend, a beautiful medium. But I think it's tough because he's the only one doing it.
Right.
And it's got to be, I feel like it's got to be really difficult to write a musical. It's nothing I've ever wanted to do, but I mean, just like think of how few we've had that have been successful since sort of like the golden age of like Tin Pan Alley and all that. And that's like 1930s, 1940s, 1920s. It's been a long time, you know? So like for him to have the success he's had, that isn't just success on Broadway, because obviously that's a scene that, even though it's kind of gone away from the limelight, has still thrived and been successful and will always have its audience. But at one point in time, that was like the going to the movie theaters was like, oh, the new Broadway play, we have to go and see that. So it's certainly not the number one medium of entertainment like it once was, although it has its fans, like anything else, like rock and roll. You know, it's not the biggest genre of music anymore. Now it's all about pop, but there are still rock bands that make a living, although they're not covered in the tabloids like they once were. So I do give him props, because I feel like to break through and like carry this, like I said, antiquated sort of like idea into the modern day that couldn't be any further away from it is very impressive.
Yeah, definitely.
So with that being said, I feel like maybe we're ready to sort of end our musicals as movies topic and sort of dive into like the critique of the film in and of itself. Are you cool with that?
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like as far as the movie itself goes, like, it's tricky because, again, in kind of bouncing off of the style of antiquated of the antiquated style of musicals, and why there are certain parts for me necessarily that still don't work for the cinematic story-going trend, is the fact that for me, I feel like the stories in and of themselves are never really the most engaging part, right? Like put it this way, right? You don't go to a musical stage play for the story, per se. You go to it for the performance and the experience, right? And again, it's interesting because within the film, right, it captures this very, oh my God, how do I put this? It captures this very kind of old school sense of like, you know, of like you said, bravado and vaudeville, you know, and you're going to see these performers, you know, move with their bodies and not necessarily with their words, right? And tell the stories in a very physical and outgoing sense, right? And that's fine and good, but like, that's not what I watch movies for, if that makes any sense. You know, like I watch movies definitely for like action and stuff, but like my favorite types of movies that I've said before are dialogue driven movies, right? And Well, I'm very much into song and dance numbers as far as that goes, right? In animation formats, as far as like surrealism, right? I think there's a couple of interesting moments where they go into musicals with like some surreal, bizarre, hokey stuff that I've seen. Like it's managed to find its way into different facets of cinema that I'm like there's a couple of Legion episodes where they just have straight up song and dance numbers and they kind of come up out of nowhere. You know, David Lynch, I know, loves playing around with just having random musical breaks in his movies, right? In order to kind of like break the feeling of reality, right? There's actually a really interesting sequence in Mad Men, in the last season of Mad Men, where Don Draper is hallucinating about his recently deceased boss, Burt Cooper, and they end up breaking into a musical number, right? Musicals have had their place as far as that goes, but it's always to me the one instance where the story almost takes a backseat, right? Because when you actually take a look at what the story of this movie is, right? No detriment to it at all. It's very, very beyond simplistic to me. That's the thing. It's not anything bad. In fact, the message of this movie is beyond incredible as far as that goes. It's just the problem is there's not really necessarily entered any deeper meaning to it, right? And I've always I don't know what it is, but there's always been something to me about like, and I'll specifically say this with modern day musicals, where I've been very, very not a fan of kind of how lofty the message is, right? Because I feel like that kind of there's this going trend of that with some of the, right? You take a look at some of the more, some of the musicals that have done like really well and gotten a lot of attention recently. Like you have Les Mis, it's like, oh, freedom during the French Revolution. That one I feel like is a weird case because that one's more of a period piece, right? So it's got, and that one I feel like has got a little bit more of an engaging kind of deeper story. And so that to me is really the only one that kind of justifies the songs. But you have La La Land, it's like, oh, pursuing your dreams. And you have Beauty and the Beast, which, okay, we've seen Beauty and the Beast already, you know, it kind of adds nothing. And The Greatest Showman, which that movie is like, would take up a whole podcast in and of itself as far as the amount of stuff that they're trying to do with that movie. But again, they've always been very, very lofty and very fun, and I get why diehard theater heads like gravitate towards them. But for me, they've always just been kind of a little bit too simplistic for me, if that makes any sense. You know, like I said, if I'm talking out of my ass, please definitely let me know. But like, I feel like that to me is, like I said, factoring into kind of the whole and into the whole kind of like that old school class of storytelling, right? That's kind of the part that really hasn't translated well for me, and I feel like that part is, I feel like that stands here as well.
Yeah, I certainly think it is tricky to make any adaptation work, but I specifically think with the musical because it's rooted in like like there's not a wide I've always kind of thought this, there's not a lens wide enough to cover everything that happens on a theater stage because there's just so much that is going on in the background, like every person in that production, even if they're like, for example, like Ghost number 4, they're still in the background of scenes adding an element of life to the performance, sort of bolstering what the stars of the play are doing. And so it's tough in like films to capture all of what happens on the stage, and I think it's a translation issue. And I think the hardest part for musicals is the filmmaker and his ability to not get too far away from what the original medium is intended for, the art, for the specific piece, like for In the Heights in this example, but also find a way to, because you're now making it a movie and the point is to bring it to new audiences who might not want to go and see the play. And so it's like the ultimate threading of a needle. And it's like, it's a task I would never want to be given. It seems very arduous and very, very tricky to do. And that's why it's, I think the reverse effect, like the 42nd Street being a movie first and then going to a play, I always feel like it might be easier to go from the movie medium first, get that right first, because it's different. It's a different conveying of emotions. But if it does work as a play, it's gonna, you're taking something that is so zoomed in the movie version, and then you're adapting it to the play, which is like this giant theater and there's so many people on stage. But when you do that from the play and you bring it zoomed into the camera, you're missing all the stuff in this area, right? You're missing all the stuff on the outside for the audio listeners. And that's always kind of how I felt. It's tricky. It really is difficult.
It is.
But I also think, back to my original point about like artists not doing their homework and studying their history, and young artists thinking that they have all the answers and not understanding the feet and the shoulders of the titans of which they stand upon. There's a reason that musicals as movies were successful for such a long time, and somewhere along the lines they stopped being. And it's like not to say this movie wasn't successful, because I do actually think it was very well executed and very well done. I just kind of think it's an impossible task, especially as we get further and further into the new decade and further away from the golden age of this genre.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess kind of if we could talk about the movie itself, right? So the movie has the narrative device of, it's being this one guy who's telling a story to this bunch of kids basically about the block that he grew up on in Washington Heights, basically this predominantly African-American and Latino area of the city at that time period. They don't really specify at what point this takes place, but like the play came out in 2005, and when we watch the movie, they all have smartphones, right? So it's the timing of this is kind of definitely interesting, right? But again, it doesn't want to get bogged down to the specifics of the time period, right? It's more so trying to tell this timeless story. But the weird thing, right, if we could just talk about like the semantics of the plot, is the fact that even though this is trying to be like a timeless story, it is both extremely timely in and of itself, as far as, dealing with still some of the plights that Latin Americans are still having to deal with in what's it called, within the kind of the immigrant experience in America, right? Kind of the plights of the past and dealing with modern day immigration policies and everything that's going on with that. And I think the movie itself is not concerned with necessarily like wanting to be a message about that, right? And I definitely think that that's where it succeeds, because the last thing I feel like anyone needs, right? You and I have already talked enough about how like that sort of political messaging has kind of affected a lot of our favorite movies a little bit too much, I'll say. But I definitely think that like it definitely hasn't invaded the musical space yet, which I'm very, very happy about, because I think that if anything needs to be more escapist than anything else, it's musicals. But I definitely think that there's something to that as far as how it's handling it. The problem that I have is that just as far as the storytelling goes, there's really not that much that actually happens here from a story standpoint. As far as like, okay, it's, just the average daily day-to-day life, right? And then it's, they're bouncing from location to location, and we're meeting all of these different characters, and then they're just, going to have fun, and then they're going out dancing and all that, and then there's a blackout. And again, all of those elements, again, I really hate to keep beating a dead horse, but I really feel like it's important, is that all of those elements portrayed on the stage to me are wonderful, and I think completely benefit the material. All of those elements for a story on a big screen, or in this case, a small screen, right? If you're watching it on your TV at home on HBO Max, I don't necessarily think work, right? But then there's still those audience members, right, who I know who love watching musicals on the theater, right? Because for them, there is no distinction, and they're just still able to enjoy what it is that they love about stage plays on the screen. I'm still trying to like figure out like where the disconnect is coming in, right? Because even as we're having this conversation, like I'm like, where does the disconnect come in?
For me, the disconnect isn't really the same issue as you. Like where because I thought this movie didn't quite work as much as I would have wanted it to. Especially because like I do agree the way that they delivered the message was tasteful, and it wasn't like Hollywood using their superiority to beat something in our heads. Like I'm sure a lot of people like can agree with this message. It's a pretty sound message, and it was very subtle. It didn't engulf the story and take you out of like the journey we were on with these characters as they grow and progress and navigate the life of living in New York City. So I actually really enjoyed it for its tasteful but yet poignant response to sort of some of the immigration stuff. With that being said, I think it is very simplistic. I think that harkens back to storytelling of yesteryear, but I also think it was a little too simplistic for its own good. I think the songs moved a lot of the narrative along, but if you blink, you'll miss a lyric, and then you'll kind of be out of the loop. And I do think that something about it just loses me, because so the way I was really thinking about it was, it's so good, yet I can't say I love it. And I was trying to decide why. Like it looks beautiful. I love that they shot it on location. It really feels like New York City, and I think that's very important when you're talking about what we're talking about in this. Like this is their home. And if you think about the whole story of like, well, we're talking about the Dreamers and how there's policies right now that are trying to get them out of the country. It's like you really want it to feel like these people, this is their home, and they would know nothing else. So they did a great, I think, such a smart thing as a filmmaker to shoot it on location. And that's why I say shooting on location is more than just going against a green screen. It's more than just, and I say going against, not a shooting on a green screen, but going against the modern tradition of shooting with a green screen. It's more than that, because I think it adds like a whole nother element of life to the story, and that was incredibly engaging. I think that the cast, everyone was perfect in their roles. I thought they were all really good singers. Like, no one felt to me like they didn't belong to be there. They all felt like, hey, you might be actually an actor who got cast in this, but your voice sounds pretty good. And like, you're actually like not a bad singer. They all felt like musicians, even if some of them weren't, and probably some of them weren't. Some of them were probably just actors who got cast and they were trying something new and they worked at it, and I think they achieved it. Where they lose me is just really the narrative, how simple it is. There's this rich political undertone, but there's not this. Like, I never really felt the struggle for Vanessa and um, forgive me, I'm forgetting his name.
Usnavi.
Usnavi. Yeah, I never truly believed their struggle and their fight to find each other. Like, it never truly felt like the Romeo and Juliet storyline that I wanted. Like, give me that. I'm okay with seeing that over and over again, especially in a musical, which is especially in a genre like the musical, rather, which is rooted in traditional Hollywood storytelling. So I'm okay with taking one of the oldest tropes where the lovers are meant to be together, but they can't because something is between them and they have to fight and eventually realize that it's worth making it. But I never like believed their struggle. It never felt like it was earned. It felt like the second couple, portrayed by Corey Hawkins and Leslie Grace, it felt like their struggle was more earned, and they had far less screen time.
Yeah. No, I'm with you as far.
And the last thing I'll say is, it kind of also felt confused. Where is this a family story? Because I was more compelled by Usnavi and his little nephew storyline,
His cousin, yeah.
His cousin, rather than Usnavi and Vanessa, which is horrible, because I thought Vanessa, every time she was on screen, she rocked, man. Her voice was amazing. She really was like so captivating. Like, I felt like she worked so well for the musical genre, which
Yes.
is awesome, because she's not, as far as I know, I looked it up, she's just an actress who took a musical role. So
Yeah.
that was very impressive to me. But I think they dropped the ball with our leads. Their chemistry was great, but they like didn't have enough of the substance to justify it.
Yeah, I'm with you as far as all that goes, because again, I think, to back on my further points, I think that all of that on stage, I think it works. All of this on screen, though, again, like, just there's something about the narrative, right? It's like her goal is like, oh, she wants to open up her own fashion salon, like, at her apartment, but she can't get the loan and everything. And then, oh, he just wants to go to back to the DR so he can open up his father's old business because he's stuck in some idea of nostalgia, and there's that disconnect there. And then also he wants to take his cousin. But meanwhile, I actually think that, like, I'm with you as far as the whole Benny and Leslie Grace. I can't remember her character's name thing, because that to me is like what's really engaging, as far as she doesn't want to go to college because she feels like she's missing something from from her experience growing up, and she feels like she's becoming too modernized, right? But at the same time, her dad wants her to have something that he never really did. As far as that goes, you're 100% right on the money as far as that narrative goes, right? And that's the problem, is I don't necessarily know if that critique comes from the original stage play, or if that comes from the adaptation from the stage play to to the big screen, as far as that goes. Because you're right, as far as the actual filming, the overall kind of simple nature of it, right, that works if your characters are engaging. But with the overall narration is how they're portrayed, you're right, there's something missing there as far as that goes.
Yeah, it's tricky, and I just don't quite know, because I also thought that maybe the intention of this was really just to be a slice of life, to show audiences a side of, I mean, you made a great comment earlier, this is a beautifully diverse cast.
Yeah.
And they're all incredibly talented, and I think Hollywood clearly is moving towards that, and rightfully so, because these are some amazingly talented actors who we get to see shine in this movie. And so I almost wonder if, like, that's okay with the filmmakers dropping the ball on that storyline, or only pushing it as far as they did, right? Maybe they don't feel it was dropping the ball because, hey, really, this is just a slice of life depiction of a neighborhood of New York City that maybe you haven't heard of too much. Maybe it's it's not Harlem, it's not like, the Cloisters, it's not like, the Village, it's Washington Heights, which is a neighborhood that doesn't really have sort of like anything that we would know of because it hasn't been portrayed before, and maybe they just wanted to give it some sort of esteem and sort of show you like a peek behind the curtain of something that you haven't been exposed to, which I think is cool, and I was all for it because I thought it was very well done. So I also wonder if there's that there, maybe it's not about, maybe the reason it's so scattered and each storyline isn't pushed as far as we kind of feel, because at the end of the film it's like, oh, the whole summer's gone by. It's like,
right, it's like you don't even feel like a day passes by by the time we get to the end, and you're like, wait, what?
Right.
The end of the summer? What happened?
But then Benny tells Nina, he's like, oh man, like, so you're going back to school? And I'm like, whoa, it's
You're
been
like,
a
what?
whole summer
What happened?
already? Okay.
That
So
was
maybe,
quick.
and then I thought to myself, maybe that wasn't the point of this movie, right? Maybe the characters were so good and the actors were so perfect in their roles that they got you invested, but maybe that wasn't the original intent.
Right.
Again, that still doesn't quite work for me, because I do think the fact that I'm speculating about what the purpose is and the fact that I can't fully critique it as a critic, I don't want to say it takes away points. This isn't a test or anything, but it does make it more difficult to say that that's a positive. Yeah. But I could see that being the case. Does that make sense?
I do, yeah. It's the trick of, kind of being a movie critic versus being like a musical theater critic. That's what I mean. There is again, like I didn't want to like kind of to jump back on my point as far as it not working. I don't necessarily, you're right. I don't think it's necessarily that it doesn't work, but it's like there is a difference in mediums. Therefore, it's like I've said this before, right? You don't levy the same type of criticism that you levy towards a movie as you would towards like a book or like a video game, right? Because they're inherently different modes of storytelling, right? In a weird way, I feel like everything that we're saying here also kind of applies to like kind of our critique as far as Mortal Kombat goes, where Mortal Kombat, even though that movie still was a step above the rest, it still kind of suffered from the same problems as far as the actual adaptation of it goes that other video game adaptations have, because they are inherently different means and different methods and different modes of storytelling, right? You're right. What I found is that a majority of musicals that I watch, the storytelling is usually not that forward moving and not that trajectory, and most of it is slice of life, right? Part of the reason why I love Jersey Boy so much is that because there's not a whole lot, I would say, that happens, right? Most of the actual like kind of forward momentum that happens in that stage play is through montage, right? And a majority of the juicy moments are kind of like the character moments, slice of life moments, right? It's different, right, on a case-by-case basis, right? But that to me is ultimately the draw of musicals, right? Is, like I said, you're not going for the story per se, you're going for the performance. The story's there, and it's definitely needed in order to make the experience work, but more than anything else, right? You're going for the stage play experience, you're going for the experience, not necessarily for the story. If that kind of makes any sense.
It does. It definitely does. And, the last thing I kind of wanted to talk about was like the music and the storytelling through music, because this is definitely one of the more heavier musicals that rely on the songs being more longer and drawn out, whereas like a Les Mis is more narrative, and then the song reinforces the narrative, but you do have actually acting. Not that you don't have it in this movie, but it is few and far between if you were to do like a breakdown of verses when they're in song and when they're not. I thought they did a great job of making it, like I said earlier, a fusion between so many different genres, like having that musical history of what this genre is built upon and paying respects to it and homage to it, while bringing in elements of the culture of which they're trying to enrich and put on display and show to like people like us who we grew up in like Italian families. Like, we don't know all the traditions, so it's like, it's cool to see that and get a taste of that and understand that. And basically it's like, the last thing, they're also getting people who might not care about any of those two things, who just like, oh, cool, there's a little hip hop in there. That's like the most popular music right now. I'm going to go check that out. I like hip hop. And it did a great job of having a little something for everything while portraying the storyline and pushing it through in a way that was like concise and clear, and every character's interjection, their call and responses all had a purpose, and it worked. And when a new character was introduced, you kind of got to see where their head was at that moment, and they joined the song, and they did a great job of like changing the mood and the motifs based on where the character was at in their individual journey. However, I don't think it was catchy enough. I think you don't leave there having something to just sing in your head. You know, like I thought the opening sequence where they sing "In the Heights," that was such a catchy little way that they sung "In the Heights," and it doesn't come back until the very end. I mean, usually you have sort of repeating motifs and themes that are, you know, overarching throughout the entire thing. And we had the overture at the end, sure, like all musicals, but I mean, the only piece I really remember was Lin-Manuel Miranda's "Shaved Ice" song, which was awesome, by the way. I loved
Yeah.
that little, like, I don't know what you call that, entendre. I thought it was really strong. It was awesome. But like that's like the only, because they repeated it so much in that song, like that's the only thing that really left me wanting to get up out of my chair and sing afterwards. And I couldn't even really remember it because it was more dialogue through song than, I think, song for the sake of music in a musical. You know, like I felt like we could have used a little more narrative so that the music could have been maybe just a little more infectious. It didn't get me the way I wanted it to. Like I wanted to go to Spotify and save the In the Heights album so I can listen to it at work this week, but I just don't think it was catchy enough for me to want to do that, and I really wanted that to be the case. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean there?
No, I get you. I get everything that you're saying as far as that goes. Like, I'll admit, like, part of the reason of why people love certain musicals is the catchiness of the songs, and that just wasn't there for me. Like, honestly, gun to my head, I couldn't name off a single song in this movie outside of, In the Heights, which was the opening track, and I couldn't name off a single lyric for that. I don't know if that's just necessarily kind of like my thoughts towards musicals in general, just like kind of the lack of kind of impact that these songs kind of had, which is really disheartening considering that, this is, I feel like, such a well done film as far as, its portrayal of message. Really, there's only one thing else that I really wanted to talk about, and I feel like it's kind of the sum up of all of our points that we brought up, though, about just the musical genre so far, which is this film's performance overall at the box office, which is, I feel like, again, it's been the kind of the narrative of this year surrounding the movies that have done well is that basically the movies that are going to theaters have been doing well, right? Like, because, obviously that's kind of what we wanted, right? We wanted to get back to the theater going experience, right? And Hollywood wanted, people to start going back to movies because that's the best way that their movies are going to continue to make money. And that's kind of the only way that, like, the old school Hollywood will continue to, like, survive in this new era of streaming and not have to kowtow to streaming and all that. But, so obviously everything that we've heard, right? Ever since Godzilla versus Kong made a big scene. Godzilla versus Kong made money. Mortal Kombat made money. Quiet Place 2 made money. Conjuring made money. Spiral made money, right? This is the first movie so far, and again, it's weird but these are really the only movies we have to compare to as far as, the HBO Max drops versus, simultaneous HBO Max and going to theaters drops, which is that this movie only cleared 11.4 million for its opening weekend. It was barely able to hit 13 million for its opening weekend, as opposed to that Quiet Place in its fourth weekend in theaters, cleared 11.7 million. So this movie was only able to come in second to a movie that has already been in theaters for almost a month now.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about that as far as that goes, right? Like, why that is. Like, is it the musicals thing? Because, of course, every critic, right, that has been kind of against HBO Max and wanting HBO Max to fail for a myriad of different reasons, right? Whether it just be the Warner Brothers of it all and kind of just the overall anti-Warner Brothers feeling in the air right now, or just the streaming of it all, right, with how badly they botched the HBO Max release, and then again not wanting to, lobby every single shot that they can towards HBO Max as far as kind of that being only because that's really the only streaming app that's kind of made its thoughts apparent as far as, okay, we are actively competing with drawing movies away from the theaters in a way that no other streaming service really is, right? Because Disney Plus is still charging people like $30 to watch their movies, and Paramount Plus has the 45-day window, and Sony has the certain day window before they go to Netflix, and every studio is doing it differently, right? So, like, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that as far as that goes.
Yeah, I think I can sum it up pretty quickly and concisely. Basically, it was already a tall order to have a musical try and achieve success outside of the Academy, sort of bringing it a new life towards the end of the year when it's going to obviously be considered for Oscar nominations. But just because, like, I don't know, for all those musicals you named earlier, the only one that I heard of making any impact in the modern day was La La Land, and part of that I think is because of the Oscar mix-up. Let's be honest,
Yeah.
it certainly
Yeah.
garnered an unfortunate
Yeah.
legacy from that, and so I just think it's already a tough enough ask outside of like Hamilton or La La Land for something to truly thrive and be successful as a musical. But then on top of that, you're closing its theatrical window. I mean, Cats was more of a meme than it was like
Right.
a successful film. And even that, Cats was so well known. I mean, this is a play that relatively had it. Like I said, it was popular in its genre and its scene, but it really never crossed over until now into the pop culture zeitgeist. And so you're going to cut into those profits by having it come out on HBO Max. There's no chance. Thank God this
Right.
isn't something that deems a sequel, because it wouldn't get it, unfortunately. Whereas
Yeah.
I think the filmmaking would have justified enough, let's say this was a traditional theatrical movie, non-musical, to get a second one and to build upon it. But the returns would not have warranted that, and that's where HBO Max hurts it. And at least that's where this one specific instance, rather, it's not detrimental, but I certainly think it's going to come in at a loss. And I think that's unfortunate. And I think it wouldn't have made too much more, but this is the kind of movie where like any bit of profit counts, right? And it's they're definitely going to be hurting a little bit from this one.
Yeah, definitely. It's hypocritical on the part of the critics, right? Because guess what? In 2 months, when Suicide Squad comes out and does great, they're going to be like, oh, HBO Max only helped it, right? So, again, it's a case-by-case basis with the movies, right? I don't think the HBO Max really has that much to do with it. It really is just in the instance of, guess what? The movies that would have already done well, that people already would have gone out to the theaters to see it, are going to do well, and the movies that would have had to struggle and really depended on the fact that they were only in theaters are going to suffer. And that's ultimately what this comes down to. It's like you were saying, this style of filmmaking, despite the fact that it's been seeing a little bit of a resurgence, is becoming a bit too antiquated for its own good, and I don't necessarily know if Lin was enough. I just don't know if Lin-Manuel Miranda is enough of a household, and I think people kind of a little overestimated him a little bit, right? I definitely think the pandemic obviously gave Hamilton a little bit of the jump up that it needed, right? But I don't necessarily know if he's got kind of like the IP power, the name power, right, to really market something like this. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to as far as kind of the overall box office. I don't think it's necessarily that hard. I think if you think about it, it makes perfect sense as far as that goes. So, as far as kind of, I feel like that's kind of everything that I really had to say about this movie. So as far as getting it going with the wrap up with my final thoughts on it, I feel like the first sentence of my Letterboxd review summed it up perfectly, which is I've said, yep, it's a musical, all right, because at the risk of, like, again, just kind of regurgitating the same spiel that I've been saying about musicals, right? There are musicals had their time, I would say, and while I appreciate that that Hollywood is still trying to make them a thing, I still think they've got a long way to go before we can finally get, like, an artist that's actually able to, like, kind of translate them into a more modernistic sense of storytelling that really works for everyone else. I think that this film, while it had the right intentions, I definitely think that I think that the craft was exceptional. This was one of the first instances where I haven't seen the craft kind of overpowering what's it called, the filmmaking in a way that's kind of detrimental from a visual sense. I still think that this kind of falls into a lot of the same pitfalls that previous musical movies that I've seen fall into, and it kind of takes away from me a lot from a movie that, while I was never certainly anticipating this as one of my favorites of the year, I could definitely say that the people who like musicals, I think, are going to really enjoy this, and I think the people who are kind of like me, I say just skip this one. If I'm being nice, I give this 3.5 out of 5 stars.
Fair enough. I think I give this 3.5, 5 stars, not giving it any sort of leeway, because I do think it was exceptional. Like I said, his ability to sort of create a genre within the musical world, merging the old and new, was brilliant. I really enjoyed sort of being let into a culture that I would really have no way of knowing about. It's like I know my cultures rather very strongly, but I wouldn't have no way of knowing sort of this type of stuff, and I appreciate it for that, especially because I love learning through things I love, in this case music, and I really felt like I did that in this movie. And again, the performances were great. Like, all of these non-singers came in and crushed it, and they honestly, I don't think anyone was poorly cast. Technically, this musical looks and sounds beautiful. It's just, I think
It's
the
a musical.
translation from stage to screen, once again, created a barrier for me. So yeah, 3.5 stars, which isn't bad, honestly. It's a pretty good score considering the slew of movies we've had this year that I've seen. So yeah. There we go.
And the only reason why I say as far as being fair is only because, like, again, because I've made my bias against these straight-up musicals live action very, very known, so I didn't want to come off as, like, being, like, inherently biased against it, you know, kind of letting my critique show as far as that goes. So that's really it. Those were our thoughts. Yeah. That's really it. Those were our thoughts on In the Heights, the movie adaptation. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Let us know if you're crazy. Let us know if you are a musical fan. Let us know, like, kind of if you're seeing something from this movie that we didn't necessarily see. Whatever your thoughts are, leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to also click the subscribe button and the like button on this video. Keep tuning back into more this week, people. Penultimate installment of the Fast and Furious. We've got Furious 7 coming on Wednesday. We've got another variety show on Friday. Be sure to also check out the latest episode of Talkin Thrones that aired with myself and Professor Pat last night. Chris, where could the good people find you?
Yeah, man, they can find me in all the same places they can find the Talkin TV podcast, at Christian Ivanko. Ivanko spelled Evanko. Since I was talking about my personal culture so much, that's actually not an Italian last name. It's a Czechoslovakian last name, just so you guys don't get confused.
I always wondered.
Because it's people like always trying to make it Italian but it's not. But anyways, yeah, so basically you can find me and my strange last name anywhere that matters on all the different social medias, and through the link in my bio you could find my music, which is coming soon, and of course please go check out the songs I already have out, because you know, music isn't as zeitgeisty as film. You know, artists can go longer amount of time without putting something out. And I think it still stands on its heels. So I hope you guys would check that out. And, of course, I have another podcast called Talking with Andrew and Chris, a show about life, music, and everything in between, all available through the link in my bio. Of course, Dom has social medias, too. And why don't you tell them where they can find you, man?
Yes, showing off my brand new bald head at Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews, all one word. I occasionally post sarcastic things and movie news and trailers, and that's pretty much it. And people, once again, thank you for tuning into a new episode of the Talkin TV podcast. We'll see you guys on the flip. Remember, as always, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll be back next week with Luca, and the week after that with the long-awaited F9. But until then, watch more fucking movies.